The problem was simple to state and brutal to solve. One woman, one cabin with walls thinner than a winter coat, one stretch of country where the nighttime temperature collapsed to 40 below and stayed there for weeks at a time, and one supply of firewood that, by every honest calculation, would not last past the first week of January. Her name was Marlow Brennan. She was 58 years old, widowed for 9 of those years, and living on a parcel of stony land near the eastern edge of a small northern county where the road grader gave up sometime in late November and didn't return until spring. The cabin had been built by her late husband in a hurry, the way men sometimes build things when they are young and certain they'll have time to fix the shortcuts later. He hadn't. The walls were single-board pine on a stud frame, sheeted once, painted twice, and insulated by hope. For most of their marriage, they burned through 8 cords of firewood a winter just to keep the pipes from freezing. After he died, Marlow cut it down to 6 by closing off the back rooms. By the 3rd winter alone, she was down to 4 cords and a constant low-grade fire. The problem wasn't the cold itself. She'd been born into this country. She knew how to dress, how to layer, how to breathe through a scarf so the moisture didn't ice up against her skin. The problem was arithmetic. Firewood cost more every year. Her hip didn't tolerate the long days of cutting and splitting the way it used to. The chainsaw, an old orange still that had outlived her husband, was getting heavy in her hands each season. She could see the trajectory clearly. Within a few winters, she would either be unable to gather enough wood or unable to afford to buy it, or both. And when that happened, the cabin would freeze around her and she would have to leave the only place she still recognized as home. So she sat down at her kitchen table one September evening with a yellow legal pad and started doing what her husband had never had the patience to do. She started thinking about the walls. The cabin was small, 24 feet by 18. 1 main room, a sleeping alcove, a kitchen corner, a tight bathroom built off the back. The exterior walls were 2x4 studs spaced 16 inches apart, with old fiberglass batting that had compressed and sagged over the decades into something closer to lint than insulation. She had read once, in a forestry pamphlet, that a properly insulated wall in her climate zone needed to resist heat loss at a rate the old fiberglass could no longer come close to providing. She had also read, in a different pamphlet from a different decade, that the heaviest, densest, most thermally stable material a person could pack into a wall cavity was something almost no one in modern construction ever considered. Sand, not insulation in the conventional sense. Sand doesn't trap air. It doesn't resist heat flow the way foam or fiber does. What sand does is something stranger and, for a particular problem, more useful. It stores heat. It holds temperature. It refuses to change quickly. A wall packed with dry sand will not warm up fast, but once warmed, it will not cool down fast either. It becomes a thermal flywheel. And Marlow, sitting at a kitchen table with a pencil and a yellow pad, understood that a flywheel was exactly what her cabin needed. Because her problem wasn't peak heat. Her problem was a long, slow, merciless bleed of warmth through 8 hours of 40 below darkness while she slept and the stove burned down to coals. She drew the plan 3 times before she trusted it. The idea was to build an inner wall, 6 inches inboard of the existing exterior wall, framed lightly with 2x2s, sheathed on her side with tongue and groove pine she could salvage in a collapsed barn down the slope. Between the old outer wall and the new inner wall, she would create a continuous cavity. Into that cavity, she would pour sand. Fine, dry, screened river sand. The kind the county sometimes sold cheap at the end of summer when their stockpile ran long. 6 inches of it, packed solid, on all 4 exterior walls, floor to ceiling, with the existing fiberglass left in place behind it as a secondary buffer against the outside cold. The math was unforgiving, but, on paper, it worked. A 6-inch sand layer, properly dry, around the entire heated envelope of the cabin, would store an enormous quantity of thermal energy once it reached temperature. The stove, instead of heating air that immediately escaped through thin walls, would heat the sand. The sand would heat the room. And when the fire died down at night, the sand would keep releasing that stored heat for hours, slowly, evenly, the way a stone hearth holds warmth long after the flame is gone. She told the man at the feed store about it. He laughed, not unkindly, but firmly, the way men laugh when a woman describes something they are sure she hasn't thought through. Sand, he said, isn't insulation. You'd be better off with another layer of fiberglass and some house wrap. She nodded politely and bought her chicken feed and didn't argue. She had stopped arguing with men about practical things some years earlier, having concluded that the energy was better spent on the practical things themselves. Her nephew Daniel came up from the city the next weekend to check on her, as he did every September, and she made a mistake of showing him the drawings. He was an engineer of some kind, software mostly, but he had opinions about physical objects the way software people often do. He told her the R value of sand was terrible. He told her she was confusing insulation with thermal mass. He told her that thermal mass only works in climates with significant day-night temperature swings and solar gain, neither of which he had in deep winter. He was, in the narrow sense, correct about all of it. He was also, in the wider sense, missing the point entirely. She wasn't trying to insulate. She already had insulation, however degraded. She was trying to buy time. She was trying to flatten the curve of her heat loss so that one fire, built once a day, could carry her through 24 hours instead of 8. Daniel left on Sunday convinced he had talked sense into her. She started buying sand the following Tuesday. The county sold it to her at $14 a cubic yard. She bought 11 yards over the course of 3 weeks, hauled in the back of a borrowed pickup, 1 or 2 yards at a time, and dumped onto a tarp behind the cabin. She covered the pile with 3 layers of plastic sheeting and weighed the edges down with stones. The sand had to be dry. Wet sand would rot the framing and ruin the experiment before it began. She spread small batches on baking sheets in her oven on low heat, 20 pounds at a time, drying each tray for 2 hours, then storing the dried sand in feed sacks inside the cabin. It took her almost 6 weeks. She was 60 pounds of sand into the project before she allowed herself to believe she might actually finish it. The framing went up in October. She worked alone, mostly, because the men who might have helped were the same men who had told her the idea wouldn't work, and she had no interest in giving them a closer view of what they assumed was her foolishness. She used 2x2s because they were cheap and because she could lift them. She nailed them to the existing studs through the old drywall, creating a parallel inner frame 6 inches inboard. She left a half-inch gap at the bottom and the top of each cavity, plugged temporarily with rags, so she could pour the sand in from above and check the settle from below. She ran the inner pine sheathing up to within 4 inches of the ceiling, leaving a slot she could feed sand through with a long neck funnel made from a cut bleach jug and a length of dryer hose. The pouring began in the first week of November. She would never forget it. The sand made a soft, dry, almost living sound as it slid down the cavity, a sound somewhere between rain on canvas and grain being poured into a silo. She filled one wall section at a time, tapping the new pine sheathing with the flat of her hand to settle the sand, listening for the change in pitch that told her the cavity was full. When a section sounded solid all the way to the top, she sealed the slot with a wooden plug and a bead of cork and moved on. It took her 11 days to fill all 4 walls. By the time she was done, the cabin weighed, by her rough calculation, somewhere over 4,000 pounds more than it had at the start of autumn. She could feel it in the floor. The whole building had become heavier, quieter, more grounded. Sound from outside arrived muffled, as if through a thick coat. The first real cold came on the 18th of November, -18 at dawn. She built her usual morning fire in the small cast iron stove, the same fire she'd built for 30 winters, and went about her day. By noon, the cabin was 68 degrees. Nothing unusual about that. What was unusual came later. She let the fire burn down through the afternoon, did not reload it at dinner, did not reload it at bedtime. She wanted to see. She wanted the first honest test. She went to sleep at 10 o'clock with the cabin at 64 degrees and the stove cold by midnight. When she woke at 6 in the morning, the indoor thermometer read 59. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, looking at that number. The outside temperature, according to the thermometer nailed to the porch post, was -23. In her old cabin, on a night like that, with the stove dead by midnight, she would have woken to an interior temperature in the high 30s, sometimes lower, with rust forming inside the window glass. 59 degrees was not warm, but 59 degrees was survivable, comfortable under a quilt, and reached without a single log being added to the fire for 18 hours. She lit the morning stove and wrote the numbers down in a spiral notebook she kept on the kitchen shelf. She underlined the 59 twice. She didn't tell anyone. Not the feed store man. Not Daniel. Not the neighbor 2 miles down the road who plowed her driveway in exchange for jars of preserved tomatoes. She had a private superstition about announcing things that were working. So she watched, and she logged, and she let the cabin teach her what it could do. By the first week of December, she had developed a rhythm she trusted. One fire a day, built at 4 in the afternoon when she came in from her outdoor chores, loaded with 3 split rounds of seasoned birch and 1 round of slower-burning oak. Damper open for the first 40 minutes, then closed to a slow burn that lasted until roughly 11 at night. By midnight, the stove was warm metal and ash. By morning, cold to the touch. And every morning, the indoor temperature held between 56 and 61 degrees regardless of what the outside thermometer had done overnight. She tested it through a -31 stretch in mid-December. 57 inside, no fire from midnight to 7. She tested it through a 4-day cold snap that bottomed out at -38 on the second night. 55 inside at dawn. The sand was doing exactly what she had asked it to do. She started running the numbers on her wood. By Christmas, she had burned slightly less than a cord. In a normal year, with the old uninsulated walls and the round-the-clock feeding schedule, she would have been 4 cords in. She was, by every accounting she could perform, on track to finish the entire winter on 1.5 cords of firewood. Not a quarter of her old consumption. Not a third. A little over a third, and falling, as her technique with a single daily fire improved. Daniel came up for Christmas, as he always did, and brought his wife and their 2 boys. He noticed immediately that the cabin felt different. Heavier was the word he used. Quieter. He asked her how the winter was going, and she said it was going fine, and she let him build the evening fire because he liked to. He built it the old way, the way his uncle had taught him, with too much wood and the damper wide open. By midnight the cabin was 81 degrees, and the boys had kicked off their blankets. Daniel made some comment about how the old place was finally heating up properly. She let it pass. In the morning, while the others slept, she stood in the kitchen and looked at the thermometer. 73 degrees, with the stove stone cold and the outside reading -26. The sand had absorbed all of Daniel's excess heat and was giving it back, slowly, all night long. He noticed, eventually, he was an engineer, after all, even if a software one, and engineers notice things if you give them enough time. On the 3rd morning of his visit, he asked her what she'd done. She told him. She showed him the notebook. She showed him the slot in the wall where the sand plug was, and she let him tap the inner sheathing and listen to the dull, dense sound of wool that didn't ring like a hollow drum. He sat at her kitchen table for a long time, doing the math on a napkin. When he was finished, he didn't apologize, exactly. Men like Daniel rarely do. But he asked if he could take the drawings home and study them, and he asked if she'd mind him telling a few people at his office about what she'd done. She said she didn't mind. She said she'd be curious what they thought. The real test came at the end of January. A storm system out of the northwest stalled over the county for 9 days. The first 3 days were ordinary winter, cold and clear and bright. The next 6 was something else. The temperature fell to -34 on a Thursday and never came back above -20 for the rest of the week. The wind ran at 25 to 35 miles an hour for most of it, with gusts that shook the windows and drove powder snow through every crack in the world. The county lost power on Friday morning, when a tree took down the line at the bottom of the valley. It stayed out for 4 days. Marlow was alone. The neighbor 2 miles down the road had gone to his daughters in the city for the week. Daniel was 800 miles away in his warm suburban house. The phone lines were dead. The road was unplowed and unpassable. The cabin had no backup heat, no generator, no propane, nothing but the cast iron stove and the dwindling stack of firewood on the porch and the 4 sand-packed walls she had built herself the previous fall. She kept her routine. 1 fire a day, 4 in the afternoon, 3 rounds of birch, 1 of oak. Damper open, then closed. She wrote in her notebook every morning by the light of a kerosene lamp. The numbers from that week are still in that notebook. Outside, the temperature she recorded ranged from -27 to -39. Inside, in the worst of it, the cabin never dropped below 53 degrees. The morning after the coldest night, with the stove dead since the previous midnight and the wind howling and the windows opaque with frost on the outer pane, she woke to an indoor temperature of 54. She made coffee on the stove with a morning small fire. She fed the chickens in the shed. She came back inside, and the cabin was already climbing toward 60. On the 9th day, the storm broke. The power came back on the 10th. The road grader came through on the 11th. The neighbor returned on the 12th and stopped by to check on her, half expecting, she could see in his face, to find her in trouble. She gave him coffee and a slice of the bread she'd baked the day before in the stove. He sat at her kitchen table and looked around the cabin and said, finally, that it felt warmer in here than at his own place. She said it probably was. She said her firewood pile was barely down a cord and a half for the whole winter so far. He looked at her for a long moment. He didn't laugh. When spring came, Daniel drove up with two of his co-workers, an older engineer named Pratt and a younger one whose name Marlow never quite caught. They had brought thermal cameras and data loggers and a great deal of curiosity. They spent 2 days measuring her walls and asking her questions and taking photographs of the slot at the top of each cavity. The older engineer, Pratt, told her at one point that what she had built was, in technical terms, a passive thermal mass envelope, and that it was being studied in some serious buildings in northern Europe, but that he had never seen it done in a residential cabin with screened river sand and salvage pine. He asked her how she had thought of it. She said she had read 2 pamphlets a long time ago and had a problem that needed solving. He nodded slowly, the way some men do when they realize they are being outpaced by something they did not see coming. If you ever looked at a problem everyone around you was solving the same expensive way, and wondered whether there might be a slower, cheaper, heavier answer hiding in plain sight, I'd be curious which part of Marlow's method struck you as the smartest. The pouring, the drying, the single daily fire, the patience to let the walls become a battery. Each piece, taken alone, was almost ordinary. It was the order she put them in that made the difference. She lived in that cabin for 11 more winters. She never again burned more than 2 cord in a season. She never once fed the fire through the night. The notebook on her kitchen shelf grew thicker, year by year, with neat columns of outdoor lows and indoor lows, and with consumption and small annotations in pencil about what the wind had done and how the sand had answered. When she finally moved into town, in her 70th year, she left the notebook on the kitchen shelf where it had always lived. The cabin was bought by a young couple who had read, somewhere on the internet, about a woman in the north who had poured sand between her walls and never fed her fire through the night. They asked, when they signed the papers, whether the story was true. The lawyer handling the sale, who had known Marlow most of his life, told them to go and look at the notebook on the kitchen shelf and decide for themselves. The walls are still standing. The sand is still inside them, dry and heavy and patient, doing the quiet work it was poured in to do. On the coldest nights of the year, in a small cabin on a stony piece of land near the eastern edge of a small northern county, a single fire burns from late afternoon until almost midnight, and then goes out, and the walls keep the cold of the door until morning. That is the whole story. That is what one woman, 1 yellow legal pad, and 11 cubic yards of river sand were able to do against 40 below. The smartest part of the build, in the end, wasn't the sand. The sand was only the material. The smartest part was a decision to stop fighting the cold 1 hour at a time and to start storing warmth 1 day at a time. Everything else followed from that single shift in thinking. She used to say, on the rare occasion she said anything about it at all, that a fire is a small thing and a wall is a large thing, and most people spend their whole life feeding the small thing when they could have been building the large one. She said it once to Daniel, who wrote it down. She said it once to the engineer named Pratt, who repeated it later in a paper he published in a trade journal that almost no one read. She said it once to the young couple who bought the cabin, on the day they came to look at it, standing in the kitchen with their hands wrapped around mugs of coffee while the wood stove ticked quietly in the corner and the sand in the walls held the warmth of a fire that had gone out 6 hours before. A fire is a small thing. A wall is a large thing. She built the large thing, once, carefully, with her own hands, in the autumn of her 58th year, and then, for the rest of her life in that cabin, she let it do the work.